Have you done?
Yeah, so
content types?
Yes.
you know the
Okay.
response side, Cheerio.
So anyone want to take a stab at, well, actually before we go into that, any questions about these? Does it all seem fresh? Right? What's a web framework do? Oh, well, all right, go for your turn and say it, but general hands up are good. All right.
This makes it easier
Yeah.
to work with servers.
Yeah, it makes it easier to work with servers, and do you have anything to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like a web framework is like a pre-written block of code that like allows you to focus more on just writing your application, because what that pre-written code does is it handles the underlying infrastructure that you need to that like handles the HTTP request response cycle, kind of all that stuff that like is needed to deal with like actually existing in the web.
Yeah, exactly. And more broad, generally speaking, whenever you're going to hear this framework and library terminology a lot, and a lot of people really, really like to hamper in on those. But truthfully, there's not really a whole lot of meaningful difference between the two. Basically, the one bit that everyone can agree with, because it's going to vary somewhat from source to source and developer to developer, is that the scope of a framework is bigger than that of a library. A library is going to be smaller comparatively to a framework, right? Another part too that I say is kind of a useful distinction is frameworks have more of are tending to be more opinionated as well. Yes.
What do you mean when it's like unopinionated?
Yeah, so when I mean opinionated versus unopinionated, that certain libraries you have to give your apps a certain directory structure, you have to name your files certain things, you have to do things a particular way, but other ones are far more flexible. For example, we're looking in React, and some of you might check out Angular. React is a little bit closer to a library, and Angular is a little bit closer to a framework. And where you can see that difference show up is in the way that you have to do there's a lot more hard requirements for how you do an Angular app compared to how you do a React app. Okay. Another difference, although I think this one is a less meaningful difference because certain libraries are quite large and certain frameworks are quite small, is that with a framework, it's mostly their code and you're just filling in the gaps with your code, right? With a framework, you almost think of it as here's a giant form and you're just filling out the templates and like adding in your own custom code on top of it. Whereas a library code, it's going to be mostly your code with pulling in just little bits and pieces of theirs. Okay. But at the end of the day, if someone describes their code as a library or a framework, that's really just saying this is how big and opinionated my bit of software is in that author's opinion. That's really the only useful distinction at the end of the day. Okay. And web framework, specifically speaking, with web frameworks, that means a framework for writing websites, specifically back-end websites in our case, right? So a little bit more heavy lifting than a library, a little bit more opinionated. As you're going to see, Express is actually, I think, a little bit closer to the library end than the framework ends. Right? They describe it as a framework. In my terminology, I almost feel it's a library because it's pretty unopinionated. You can lay your apps however you want, and it's not batteries included. We're going to see that if you want to do anything meaningful with Express, we're going to have to bring in other packages and libraries as well. But nonetheless, they describe it as a web framework. Okay, any questions on that? Okay. How about by an API? What does an API mean?
It's an application program interface. Essentially, it's like a hosted service that we can like access certain data, like a set of data from another website that we can manipulate and use in our own local computer.
Yeah. And the part that's a little bit confusing, that's all true, but the part that's a little bit confusing with modern terminology is it's kind of like this. We have APIs, we have web APIs, and we have REST APIs. Where REST APIs are web APIs are APIs, and by extension, REST API is still a type of API. And these are just more and more specific types of APIs, right? It's going from a rectangle to a square to a 2-inch square, right? We're getting more specific about exactly what type of API it is. And the part that's a little bit confusing about this is depending on which field or industry you're in, these terms might be used a little bit more loosely. So as a web programmer, people will often say, oh, I'm using so and so forth API, but what they really mean is they're using this particular REST API or this particular web API. So often these will just be referred to as APIs, even if there's a little bit more specific of a terminology for them.
So the way that I always describe it in my terminology for an API, what would you point that to? Just a normal API?
You're sounding like a web API,
Oh, okay.
which is fine. That's
Okay.
still an API, just a more specific time. And when, by and large, web APIs and RESTful APIs are simply just called APIs. But in the most general sense of the term, they aren't quite inclusive enough.
What's the difference between that top level one and the web API?
So the API is super general. It could be something completely unrelated to the web. Like let's say you're writing code for a Raspberry Pi, right? And that Raspberry Pi provides a library that you can turn on this light or turn off this sensor. Those methods and functions that it provides to do those operations, that's an API. An API in general is just how one piece of software connects to another piece of software, right? So earlier on when we were in Q1, whenever we use documents, .query selector, document.append, all those different document stuff, that's an API as well. That's the DOM API, where all the DOM API is stored on documents. Whenever we use .foreach, .map, .reduce, that's an API as well. That's an API for arrays in JavaScript, right? Those are programming language APIs, where web APIs are, I go to this website, to this endpoint, and I get some data back. And that's the type of APIs, when we say APIs for this unit, that's what we mean is a web API in general. That doesn't invalidate our prior definition, but whenever you're reading articles, or hearing me talk up here and I say API, I'll often mean an API such as, okay, I could go to, for example, this is a really popular one, the Pokey API. Where, to the site. Where a common use case for web APIs is an endpoint or website that you can access programmatically, like through your code, that can give you some sort of data or process some sort of information for you. So this one, for example, is an API that lists everything about Pokemon, right? So I go in here and I can say Pokemon/4. And then inside of here, it's going to give me all the information about that particular Pokemon. And there are all sorts of different APIs about all sorts of different things, right? From the interesting to the mundane to the useful, right? There are APIs that allow you to read from a Google Calendar, right? They can say, given this Google's users information, how we do their calendar. For example, a side project I'm working on right now is, you know how I Slack the schedule out to you for the lectures in the week? I have a Google Calendar where I put those as well. It'd be really handy if I had a website that I could point you to that would just read from that calendar and give you the week's schedule. Well, there's an API for that, right? I have code that can talk to Google's calendar APIs to give me that information for my app, as a more useful example.
So when you say, web framework is the general framework, and API is kind of the specific things that we use to kind of create various things?
I see. So a web framework I want to say this precisely. Web frameworks are frequently used to make the process of authoring web APIs easier. So a web framework is used to build a web API. And accordingly, an API that you build might consume other APIs, right? This is all kind of an intertangled web, right? The Pokemon API inside of it might call other APIs to process its data. Not so in this case, but that can be the case, yes.
So, I guess a web API is really any sort of programming interface that allows the client to more efficiently request data from the server.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, it's just a facade in front of that data, right? And why do we have these web APIs, right? Because recall from our drawings last week, it basically looks like we have a server and we have a database. Right, and the server talks to that database and we talk to the server. Why not just let the client talk to the database directly? Right, because that's the end of the day what's happening, right? We talk to google.com, google.com loads those calendar appointments and then serves them up back to the client. We hit the Airbnb API to see what rental properties are available in Seattle, and it returns it back over the wire as a JSON response. Why not just let the client talk directly to the database?
It'd be total chaos.
Yeah, it'd be chaos. If we let people talk to our database directly, that's very insecure for starters, right? We don't want to give the world open-ended access to our database. So that's the first reason for web APIs, is it just provides some security and some access control around that database. Can't think of any other reasons why we have this server act as a middleman for the database.
I mean, it all feels like, they could hack it in some way. I mean, it's all the same kind of issue. I don't know what else. They can mess with your code. They can steal your code.
All those are true, but what else we got?
The server could, I guess, manipulate that data as a middle step.
Exactly. That server can manipulate that data to make it easier to work with, right, for various reasons. Maybe we're going to do some filtering or sorting for them. Maybe we just don't want our users to have to, or even our client integrations, to have to worry about the nitty-gritty of piecing that data together from the database, right? So it's a little bit more user-friendly having that middle step in front of it.
One question I have is that a term I've heard a lot speaking to other web developers is like business logic. Would the server code itself be what's considered business logic in that respect?
Yep, it would be. So for example, let's say that this server was Amazon, and let's say this is a database of Amazon products. The actual picture is a little bit more complicated than one database and one server, but let's pretend for now. We don't want to just give all the products out. We want to give just the products about, say, pet products, right? Products for cats and dogs and so forth. So the first bit of the server is it's going to give us just that slice of the data. Furthermore, another thing the server could facilitate is even if we were to reduce it to just pet products, how many pet products do you think are available on Amazon.com? A lot. More than you're going to be able to return in one response. So this server can facilitate something called pagination of that data, which will give us just a slice of that data and will allow us to step through it slice by slice, not to overwhelm our clients. That's another thing that the business logic can facilitate here. Yeah.
So are APIs basically just used to deliver information from a server to a client, or does it go the other way too? Like you interface through an API to post data from a client?
Yep, both ways. APIs in most cases are just a glorified middleman between the client and the database to facilitate the trade of information from them. Yep. One slight caveat to that is APIs can call other APIs, right? So it might pull some data from your database and some data from over there, but same end idea. APIs roughly serve to just grab data from the client and massage it into the right form to either put into a database or to serve to another API or to pull that information in and bring it to the clients.
So is JSON, I mean, I know JSON's kind of it's sort of the middleman between us and the server.
Yeah, JSON's just one particular language it can speak, right? I'm giving information to you as a class in English. We have to have some sort of language or protocol to do this over. If we're going to transmit information from here to here and from here to here, we're going to have a language to do that in. And JSON is one of the most popular ways to do that. And we're going to see that's really what web programming is all about, is just taking data and massaging it to the correct form for that purpose and moving along the train, right? So we're going to go from a form in a client, right? Let's say it's a new user sign up. Let's visualize this. So the user types in all the information. We're going to use JavaScript to turn that information from the form into JSON. We're going to send JSON through the wire up to the server. The server is then going to take that JSON, turn it back into a JavaScript object, specifically a node JavaScript object in our case. Then we're going to take that JavaScript object and turn it into a SQL row in a database. Then when the user looks up the profile information, the same thing almost is happening in reverse. We're going to look up the database, user in the database, which is going to be a SQL row. We're going to load it up into a JavaScript object inside of Node. Node's going to turn that into JSON, send it a response to the client. Then the client's likely going to take that JSON response and build an HTML view out of that JSON response, just like we're doing Q1. That's really all there is to it. It's almost remarkably unexciting in some ways, right? All we're doing is turning things into out of JSON, right?
I think API has like function in programming language.
Yep, that's how I like to think of it in that way too. I think of every API call as a function call, right? Because functions have a request, the invocation, they have data that goes along with it, the function parameters.
It's just like pre-built code that you can call.
Yep, it's just pre-built code on a different server that you can call. That's a good way of thinking of it.
Thanks.
Yep. Any other questions?
So would JSON be an API for JavaScript? I'm not sure because it's kind of interactive with.
The connection between JSON and JavaScript is in some ways coincidental and circumstantial. JSON is purely the language of this right here, right? This client and server talking to each other, that's what the JSON's going on. So for example, you can build a front end in CoffeeScript and do a back end in, I don't know what's the language to hit these, Golang or something. They'll still likely talk over JSON because it's a relatively easy format to work with. And it's kind of interesting coming at this from learning JavaScript first. It makes some things easier and some things more difficult. The part that makes it easier with all this is, oh, okay, we have JavaScript in the client. We're talking over the wire over JSON, which is close-ish to JavaScript. And then we were writing Node on the server, which is also JavaScript. If we were doing a Java backend, communicating over XML instead of JSON, and then using JSON in the DOM, sorry, JavaScript in the DOM, we would be able to see these separate parts a little bit more readily because there would be language differences. Here, if you squint, they all kind of look the same. So you have to remind yourself as you're going through this is, what am I writing? Am I talking about code that's on the client? Am I talking about code that's on the server? Or am I talking about the information I'm exchanging between the two? Because they all look very, very similar. I guarantee before the end of this, someone's going to be on the server and they're going to do document.querySelector, which doesn't make any sense if you think about it, right? Because that's browser code. You wouldn't expect that to work over here. But since it's both JavaScript, since we're doing Node, it can be easy to fall into that mistake. And not quite as easy as a mistake, but a similar mistake is thinking that this is JavaScript. It's not. This is just JSON, which is text that looks like JavaScript objects, but it's not. It's just a data change format. It's a very popular one, right? If you get out here and you start building stuff in C# or Node or Java, you'll probably still use JSON here anyway, right? There's nothing about it that really uniquely ties it to JavaScript at this point. And it's not the only language over here too, right? There's also XML. There's also some GraphQL stuff that's a little bit different, right?
It's so easy to forget that JSON is a string because if I do console log some JSON, it looks, it can, like in the Chrome DevTools, it looks just like an object. It doesn't look
Yep,
like a string.
it's confusing. The other part that's confusing too is both on the front end and the back end. A lot of the times things will be implicitly converted from JavaScript to JSON and back for you, right? Like on the Node when we say response.json, we feed it in JavaScript and it, turns that into JSON and sends it over the wire. And since it does that conversion for us, it's easy to forget that it happens. And then there's other spot where you'd expect it to do that conversion for you from JSON to JavaScript and it doesn't.
This might be a little off topic. So is there a reason why we use so many different languages to create this instead of kind of just, well, we started with this language, we're just going to follow through? Did it become complex, or was it like, that battle versus, good versus test?
Sure. The optimistic answer for that is technologies and tools are constantly improving and adapting. You want to use the right tool for the job. The pessimistic answer is that we're all fashion driven and we all change our minds so much that things just kind of change over the years, right? It's whatever's hip this year. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about this process here, draw it out on a table, about when you do an API call, what is happening at each stage of these and which language is going on. Right? We're using JavaScript here. What are we using right here and here? What's up? How much would you? Oh, I figured out my question for you.
Okay, I'm glad to hear.
Yeah. I personally use Cool, not HTTP, but when I do my lecture examples, I like to use HTTP. And for a split second, I forgot how to do a push request successfully in it. So I just wanted to double check it with you, but I got it figured out.
Okay. Glad to hear.
Yep. Thank you. What? He works here.
Oh, Charlie asked me a question earlier.
Charlie, would you say it's a fair assessment to say that API is effectively a connection between the stack and the server? So if the client is communicating with the server, so this is like the web API, like
So the web API,
Well, technically speaking, I consider the server. I consider the server as an API. It's kind of like this is the API call. This is the API. This is the API. So we're using JavaScript. This is the function. This is the application. Yeah, so for example, this is JavaScript. It's like this is the function. And that's our, this is the function application. This is the references in natural data. Somebody else. So APIs never call you. And then the database. Have it is here. Make a request to the service. And then here, you could make a request. I think the one that's really and then that's a good question. Yeah, and then it's mine's going out there. You're the same information. When you're going back, you're setting a file. This is files using a snapshot. This is you could be for example,
Yeah.
So we're, at the client side, we use JavaScript.
Yeah.
And the server side is JavaScript.
So that's the other part, right? The client.
Why this relationship?
In this case, JavaScript organized. Well, so the client makes the request. The server is whoever takes the request. So the client and the server send the request. The server lives in whoever instead of the server is the JSON that accepts the request. It sends response. Like we have to communicate the lowest common denominator.
And then so these are
Right, the only thing they both speak is text.
Well,
Sometimes you don't have JSON.
Just curious.
Like the JSON knows body is.
I mean, it's okay to have different parts, just kind of.
Well, because so as engineers, there is no way using pure JavaScript to have one computer talk to another computer, because that would be very insecure. Instead, that they talk to each other in a way to so they might be sharing the most common format for two computers.
So an HTTP request has three different parts, but the two parts you care about is the headers and the body. The body is where the JSON lives.
Okay, got it.
thinking is like the jet.
Okay.
We so get it.
Yay! All right, so let's do a review of how to set up Express for this.
Okay, I have to, like, if I'm thinking about this.
So I made a new directory.
I say the word cat. That cat is
Oh, excuse me, everyone. So I made a new directory. I'm in Express intro. Do not call your directory Express or bad things will happen. Just in general, never name your directory anything that is identical to one of your packages that you're installing. Otherwise, the plumbing will just break down. So I went ahead and we'll run npm init y, git init, git add package.json, git commit m add package.json. Okay, and what that's doing is that initializes a project with a blank package.json in a Git repo that is tracking that package.json. You all might prefer to start your project in GitHub and then clone down from there. That's a little bit simpler in some ways, but this is a little bit faster once you get good at it. So I'll give everyone a second to do this real quick. Yep, this is a code along.
Should we also name it Express Intro?
Name it anything but Express.
Okay.
Express Intro is a fine name though.
Is take for folder file?
Say again.
Is take folder file?
I think for a folder.
Wait, it has to be in temp.
No. I'm just inside of my temp folder.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Starting from scratch, right?
Yep. You can make this directory wherever you want to organize on your computer. I don't know if you have a lecture notes or a projects folder, wherever makes sense to you. I'm getting rid of this code after this lecture. That's why I'm working in temp personally.
Okay.
So you put something in temp, like it will automatically be erased.
Yep. Everything that's in the temp folder will get periodically erased from there.
Oh.
So if you're just doing, it's kind of like the scratch file.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, is this what sometimes you see something in your trash can?
Trash can doesn't use temp, different concepts. But the temp folder is just for you to make, it's like scratch paper, right? Just whenever you have to do temporary stuff, it's useful to go in there so it can clear it out.
I saw the BOS just delete something in the trash can.
Oh, that's something else that's doing that. Okay,
Wait, Charlie,
yeah.
what did you do, what's the PWD and then the path, what did you do that for? Was that?
That was just print working directory to show you that the name was Express Intro.
Oh, okay.
You only really need to follow from here down. Okay, everyone get that in? All right, and then what I'm gonna do is, if you wanna type along with me as I'm going, you can. You probably don't want to because I go through this really, really fast.
You're gonna slack it out.
So, no, I'm not gonna slack it out. I'm gonna leave it up and periodically give you a chance to code along and catch up to it. That's kind of gonna be the workflow today. You can type along, but I'm not typing at a pace I intend you to match with. Because I've made these servers probably like 300 times. You've made the server like 4th time. I'm not expecting you to type it at the same pace. Okay. So once you're done with that, see how in here in package.json it says main is equal to index.js? Something that's a handy convention to have is the main file of your app, right? Because we're going to be ultimately having multiple JavaScript files. Wherever you want the starting point to be, main should point to it right there. The reason why you want that to add up is because whenever you work with an Express with a Node app, you should be able to do this. Git clone wherever it lives, step 1. Step 2, cd into there. Step 3, npm install to bring in all the dependencies for that app you cloned down. And step 3, npm start. And what npm start does is it basically says node and it points over the main file is right here. Now you don't have to have that. If you don't have that though, whoever clones down your software is going to have to know which file to point node at. Additionally too, this doesn't have to say index.js. You can make it say app.js or server.js or whatever. It doesn't really matter which one. The ones I see are the most popular is it seems roughly 30-30, 1/3 split between app, server, and index. I personally call mine index just because that's the pre-written name, so it's a little bit easier, but you don't have to call it that. Furthermore, it doesn't need to match up, but you lose that additional benefit. So it is a nice thing to do. As such, I'm going to call my file index.js. Then you're probably going to want to open that up in Atom, or open up the whole directory in Atom, I should say. Okay. Anyone recall what the first thing we want to do for this is?
Bar express, bar.
Yeah, we're going to load in all of our dependencies up at the top of the file. So far, all we have is express. Let express equals require express. Does this name here have to match up with this name right here?
No.
No, it doesn't. It just has to be a valid JavaScript name. No requirement there.
Single quotes don't matter, right?
Say again?
Single quotes don't matter.
Single quotes, double quotes don't matter. Both are fine.
What about for JSON?
For JSON, double quotes only. For JavaScript, they don't matter. That's another part too. So keep in mind that JSON is a subset of JavaScript, but it's not equivalent, right? So certain things you can do in JavaScript you can't do in JSON. One of those is single versus double quotes. JSON only takes double quotes. All right, so what's this doing right here?
It's requiring the express package that you have.
Yep, and if it didn't work, let's say we had something like this. Oh no, why didn't it work, guys?
You don't have Nodamon, do you?
Well,
Install Express.
yeah, another thing I want to start helping you get better and better at is these error messages can seem pretty freaky at first, but once you learn to approach them with calmness, you'll often find they're more helpful than they first look. So, cannot find module express. Well, first thing is, did I spell the module name right? In this case, yes, I did. Another one is, did I remember to install it? Is it inside my node modules? / is inside my package.json. Well, neither. It's not my package.json, nor is it inside my node module. So I'm going to go ahead and install that and try again. Yes.
Is there a reason why we wouldn't save it here or add like the save flag when we run that command so like it's added to the package.json?
That used to be a requirement. The API changed, so now it saves by default. Yeah, the behavior of it used to be if you did install without save, it would add it to node modules but not to package.json. But as of NPM version, I'm not sure, it changed the default behavior. So notice I just typed express, but it's actually inside of our package.json now as well.
Okay. And what about like the save dev thing? If you want to save like a development dependency?
Then you need save dev.
Then you need save
But if you want to save the dependencies, and if you check the internet, most of them will still say save because it was like that way for a very long time. This is a fairly recent-ish change. Any other questions?
When you were starting out and you said npm start,
Yeah.
but if you had had a script in there, it was called start, it would have done that instead of main, or no?
We'll come back to that a little bit later. I don't want to focus on that too much. My only point for now is that be a good guy in general and make your main file match up to that main in there because things will work nicely later if you do. Right? It's just a tidy thing to do. We'll go into all that wiring at a later time though. Okay. So what's the next thing we need to do?
Set up our app.
Yep. So we create the app itself by invoking the express function. Okay. Another thing we need to do is that in this file, the port is typically declared as a variable. And we're going to set the server to listen. We could do it like this, app.listen 3000. console.log server started on port 3000. This will work, but there's a number of problems with this approach. Right? And for starters, to review what the port is a little bit, the way that I visualize servers, right, we're going to look at a different level of abstraction right now. Let's blow up the circle a little bit. Is a port is something that you plug a device into, right? Like on here, I plug this HDMI cable that keeps breaking into my HDMI port. My keyboard is plugged into my USB port. It wouldn't be very useful if our computer only had one port, right? Well, as such, it makes sense that there's multiple digital ports for a computer to connect to, right? So you can think about a server as having tons and tons of these little invisible ports. So we can have multiple servers listening, we can have multiple connections going on, and we're choosing which particular port that our server software is going to bind to. The most popular port for production is 80, and I think it's 443 is the other one. One's HTTP and one's HTTPS. For development, we can basically use whatever server we want. It's common to use a really high number like 3,000 or 6,000 or something like that. The reason behind that is while any application can use any port, the lower number ports have semantic meaning. Like port 22 is generally SSH, HTTP is generally 80, and as those are somewhat important, you have to have root permit on certain systems. You have to have root privilege in order to serve something on those ports. Meaning, if I were to type in 80 right here, instead of node index.js, I'd have to type in sudo node index.js.
Why sudo?
Because sudo is to run something as an admin, and only admin can access port 80. And if for no other reason than inconvenience, we don't want to have to type sudo in front of it in development. That's just kind of inconvenience. There's lots of other good reasons that I'm not going to go into right now that we don't want to run this as sudo. If you're curious, talk to me after class and I can share those with you. But generally, good idea to not do that. Can anyone think of any other reasons why this is bad as here? Yes?
My perception, if it's like app.listen 3000, the only place you can access that server is 3000, so wouldn't we want it to be more dynamic? Like, just be like, I want you to go here, or if that's not available, go to the next thing?
We do want to be more flexible. We don't want to try random ports per se, but yes, do you have?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, but you remember how I just said in development this makes sense to put in 3000, but in production we're not going to want to serve this on 3000. We're going to want to serve this up on the standard ports.
So like Derby or whatever that is?
Close. So where I'm getting with this is it's very common in organizations to have one team or individual that writes the app and one team or individual that deploys the app. Right? The process of taking code and running it on a server is non-trivial. It is an expertise in and of itself. And as such, they are not application programmers necessarily. So it's weird to expect them to go into your source code and change it when deployed. If you ever work for a job and their deployment process involves opening up the app.js file and changing 3080, you should run screaming because you're working for a bunch of idiots. If you do that in this class, that's okay because you're inexperienced. But if you're a professional and still doing that, there's something going wrong. Sorry to say. And that'd be weird, right? For one, I hope that feels wrong. The idea of someone having to go in there and change one line. Right, to add a little bit more rationale to why that's weird. They may not even have the expertise to do that. But beyond that, it's just a very fragile thing, right? That's a weird deployment process.
What would you do instead?
So instead what we do, and this is a bigger idea than today, and I'm going to be refreshing you on this as we go across this, anything that is meant to be configurable, right? Anything that's going to change across different invocations of this app, if it's development versus production, should be configured through environment variables, right? So we want to configure this through an environment variable. One additional reason that this is bad, though, is this is a magic number. We have no idea what this 80 is. So even if it was just, say, we're still missing the other advantage I talked about being able to configure this, but this is still better because now you at least know what that's doing in there. I remember when I first started coding at Amazon, there was a bunch of different files I worked with that had all these variable declarations at top and then they used in the functions below. And I was like, what's the point of this extra step? Why don't they just put the numbers down in there? This seems unnecessary. And I took them out. And I was the only one who maintained that code base. And about like 6 months later, I was like, man, I wish I remembered all these. Oh, wait a minute. I screwed myself 6 months ago by changing all of these. That's why you learn a lot at Amazon, by the way, because they let you make very big mistakes very early on and no one will stop you from it. And experience is the best teacher. So that sucked. Anywho, configuration stuff, or wherever it's not obvious what's going on in there, right? Like if you have something like calc.add 2 and 4, I think it's pretty obvious what those arguments are. But whenever these arguments are something non-trivial, you really want to have a variable instead of a number, because otherwise it's magic numbers. They call it magic numbers, so you're like, well, what is that number supposed to be? Right? Just kind of some random number, what does it do? And it's going to be very hard to read that code later. Even though it's easy to write in the moment, think about what this code's going to look like to someone such as yourself after not looking at it for 6 months. Right? Another reason why software rewrites are so popular, right, is because code is far easier and more fun to write than it is to read. Reading code is much, much harder than writing code, actually. Right? As such, you should be optimizing the code you write for ease of reading, not ease of writing. Right? It's actually much harder to write simple, easy readable code than complex code. Okay. So we're going to do port. Then, in order to get us that ability to configure it, we're going to do a little trick back from Q1. Yep. Process.env.port or 3000. Another thing that's not really a major point of this, but I'm just going to throw it out because someone's probably wondering it. This is my personal preferred way to use const, is I like to use const for anything that's a semantic constant inside of a file, and then name it with all capitals. I think I'm the only one who follows this convention. So if you made this all const or all let, it would have been the same difference. That's just how I personally like to organize my code. And process.env, what that does is you can read any environment variable on your system through process.env. Process is just a node built in about the process. It's kind of like document. For example, I can go into the REPL, and I can say process.env.path. There's my path. Process.env.whatever, and I can access or set any environment variable. Yes?
Environment?
Yep, env is short for environment. So what I could do is I can say export port equals 80. Don't run this one. But what's going to happen when the deployment engineer deploys this is they're just going to set an environment variable called port and set it to the proper port for production. That way, our app here will use that. If that environment variable is not set, then it's going to use 3000. Right? That's what this little OR trick means. It means if this variable exists, use it. Otherwise, use value 3000. Okay, and that's the better way to configure this. And then we use the port right here. Another issue too is, see how I hard-coded 3000 in here? That's a lie, right? So we want to set that from a variable as well, right? That's duplication if we have 3000 here and 3000 there. So that's another reason why this variable is a good idea.
Should we do like, yeah.
Like so.
There's
Yes.
a convention that whenever you're pulling something from an environment variable into a JavaScript file, you would name the JavaScript variable with all caps.
Yep, that's a convention. Another convention, so environment variables by convention are all caps. That's one reason to make that line up. Another one is back before we had const, things that were const were meant to be all caps. Right, so for both reasons, I name it all caps. Okay, so everyone, I'll give you a chance to get this up and running.
So if you do const port, if there's no process.env.port that is established, then it establishes at 330. per 3,000 until someone lets our code export or.
Yeah, each time this code is ran, it's going to look at this value. And the way the OR operator works is it returns the value of the last thing operated. And it's short circuit evaluates. So if we have true or hello, that's going to evaluate to true. Because if we know this is truthy, we don't have to look over here. Right? And then if we have false, or in our case, undefined, such as that process.m.port is undefined, or 3000, that's going to evaluate to 3000. Whereas if we had that variable set to say 80, right, that's the mechanics of that trick.
Tell me again, I mean, I know you mentioned it, but what was so bad about, or why should we run from a company that uses 80s?
Yeah, so the motivation behind all of this is we want to make it such that we can configure this without changing the code to use different ports for development and production, right? Because in production, we want to use these conventional ports that our system is going to expect. And in development, we don't want to use those ports because they require admin privileges. So we configure it through an environment variable. As a quality of life thing, we say if that environment variable is not defined, i.e. if we're not in production, use 3000. And do that, we do this OR trick. Where the OR trick is OR returns the last thing evaluated. If this is truthy, it's not going to evaluate over here. So if that environment variable is defined, we're just going to use it and not the other value. Right? Another way you can read that, ideally I want you to understand the mechanics of this, I really do, but frankly, if you read this as if defined, use that, otherwise use that, that's close enough.
So I should be able to run this as npm start.
We haven't done enough yet to make that work. Later on, we're going to wire it up to do that. Yes?
Where's process.environment.port?
Process is a node global, right? It's in every one of your node scripts, just like document is in every one of your front-end scripts. And one of the properties available on it is env, which contains all of our environment variables.
Wait, sorry, what is listen again?
What is what?
Listen do?
Listen starts the server,
Oh.
which is basically a while true loop. Whenever there's a connection, it's going to look for a matching route for that request.
Okay.
We don't have any routes yet, so this server will effectively do nothing, but that's where we're going. Yes?
Just, this is kind of a small point, I guess, but if you're not planning on ever renaming or reassigning anything to the express or the app variables, then why wouldn't you use const for those? Or does it not really, it doesn't really matter?
I have philosophical issues with const, that's why.
Okay.
That's a personal problem, though. I don't think the two characters are worth it, so I shall not use them. No, but seriously, my personal coding philosophy is the simpler, the better. Wherever I see room for simplicity, I shall include it. Const is more complex than let, and if I'm getting no additional value for using it, I'm not going to do it. Same reason why I don't do semicolons. In my opinion, they achieve no additional value, so it's noise, right? That const is adding noise to the code. Those semicolons are adding noise to the code, so I choose to omit them.
And in the case of the port, you would use const. Why?
I'm using const there because that one is a semantic constant, right? When I say const, I say things that I know I'm only going to set once, not change, that have semantic meaning as a constant, right? So that's why I said it that way. To me, it adds some special semantic meaning to it. For most of you out there, you're probably just going to use let the whole way through or const the whole way through. That's just my personal convention for it. And since we can all hold such wildly varying opinions and the code still works, that probably means at the end of the day it doesn't really matter that much, right? Too many opinions in developer land. If I was more opinionated, I would force something on you either way, but I don't truthfully think it's that big of an issue, so that's why I say, yes, I do have my own reasons for my choices on here, but whatever one you use, it should be just fine. Any other questions? Great. So let's kick off route. I'm going to say app.get. What do you guys want to make an API about?
Stuart, sorry.
Stewart's on a very broad topic, a little bit more general.
How about people in the class?
People in class.
Fishing.
I try not to use people that I know because that can get weird fast. Fish.
How about in news?
News. All right, we'll do the news.
Fake news.
We'll do fish too. We can do all the above. We can have all the routes we want. Oh wait, you guys know ES6 arrow functions now. Yay.
Yay.
Okay. So what's happening behind the scenes is every time there is a connection, it's going to look at the path that it was accessed at, and it's going to look for a matching route defined in your app. In this case, if we get something with the path of news, response.json, news equals lots of it. Now, you can return other things inside of Express. You can have Express return a file. You can have Express render an HTML template. You can do lots of different stuff. We're going to be using it almost exclusively for JSON APIs. That's why I went ahead and did response.json right there. Then we can save it, run the file. Oh, I'm already running it. So that's another common error that people can run into. Error.news, which is short for error address in use, : 3000. So this is Express's obnoxious way of saying that port is in use, right? Because we can only have one listening per port. And what that means, and what happened is over on this other terminal tab, I had Express running. So I'm going to kill that over there. Launch it again. Actually, this is something unrelated. Never mind. I was running a different server. Okay. Node index.js. Server's running. Then we could go over to our web browser and we can say localhost 3000/news. And then we'll see that. And what I typed in is localhost : 3000. I'll go into what localhost means in a second. But 3000 and the /news should look familiar. That 3000 corresponds with the port I set right here. And the /news is what connected us to this route right here. If we typed something other than /news, we would have gotten something different.
Where did you type in localhost 3000?
Into Chrome.
Oh.
Yep, localhost : 3000/news. So I'll give everyone a minute to get caught up on this, and then we'll do a 5-minute break. So I'll help, and then we'll resume at 11:05.
I think I'm gonna start then,
We haven't configured npm start to work yet.
oh, so that's what I can't see. It was
So do node.
oh, just a node.
So on the terminal, that's where we want to run our index.
Yep.
Oh,
All this node stuff too, we have to do through the terminal, right? Some of the stuff we were doing early on in this course, it was optional whether you did through the terminal or the GUI. There's a lot of node things that must be done through the terminal. That's the only way. Hence why we spent a good week learning it. What's up?
Oh. Damn it. Okay, it's working.
I'm getting error.
Just in parentheses after the this. So let's go back and see where they probably even line number 2. So let's go back where we're going. So at line number 11. So let's look at line number 11. What?
To get the node to work.
No.
Yeah, question.
Yeah, so like we did this, right? And I kind of understand what's going on here.
Yeah.
And we get this, and I just choose it.
Yeah.
Or whatever. But like, what is this actually? You can just whenever I go to the website, honestly pretty shitty. Is this how you serve up the HTML?
Because we're not writing a website right now, we're writing API. But that's why.
Okay. I guess if you get the header of what really the API is.
It's kind of a subtle concept. It'll make it a little bit more clear once we build the front end. Yeah, but you're right, a real world site doesn't work like this.
Right, so like, we're building an API, you said?
Yeah, because it's roughly like this. Or generally we have,
Yeah.
so we have some sort of like React app that's going to do this request to our server, and it's going to get that JSON. And then that React app is going to take that JSON and build HTML out of it. Well, we have to name React app, we're just requesting
React being like that, we're doing later?
Yeah, or DOM manipulation even.
Okay.
But since we're just grabbing that endpoint,
Basically, you're saying the default parameter right there, because then
that's where it is
the
the
defined.
Okay.
Now, with the server startup, what am I doing this year?
For
Like,
processing.
Localhost 3000 slash whatever you need. Processing
Yeah.
towards
Yeah.
slash hours.
That's fine, how's your review? Alright.
Just kind of, I think it caught the cold everybody has
Yeah.
yesterday.
So you don't recommend setting the like port 3000 to be default parameter inside of the app.listen?
That's what we're indirectly doing right here. So if there is no environment variable called port, it's going to be set to 3000 down there. A little bit roundabout, but same end goal.